All right, let's look at lesson 6, and this is entitled Day of Atonement and Blood. That's really chapter 16 and 17 of Leviticus. Chapter 16 is all about the Day of Atonement. Chapter 17 has some regulations and mention made of how animals are to be dealt with, and the matter of blood comes up there. So we'll look at that briefly toward the end of the study. So let's start out by a little review, and you might get excited about the fact this is our last night in Leviticus. We're moving on to Numbers and Deuteronomy. But I hope that it's been worth our while to look at this book. I think sometimes it gets passed over, not much attention paid to it. And I will just say, I don't know how you're going to understand the book of Hebrews, for instance, without having some insight into the book of Leviticus. Just think where we'd be if we didn't know any of this information, and we're blessed to have it. So, quick review here, 3 questions from 2 weeks ago. The ceremonial requirements God commanded were not as important as the moral requirements. What would you say? No, why not? Why is that incorrect, would you say? Okay. Uncleanness fit whether it was ceremonial or whether it was moral. We looked last time at Leviticus chapter 19, which is interesting because right in the middle of this matter of purity, and especially there, chapters 18 and 20 with moral purity, is this matter of a lot of different regulations. And I don't know if you remember, but one of those we looked at is one of the ones that Jesus said is the second most important command in the law, which was what? You need to do what? Love God as, with your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbors yourself. That's in Leviticus 19, along with don't use 2 different kinds of thread in a garment. And leave some corners of your field to feed the stranger in the land. So it's not making a distinction from one chapter to the next about, okay, this is all right, but this is not as serious. It's putting that all together to say it's all important. Now, obviously, there are some things that maybe have greater implications for us, but God has His law and expects it to be respected. So, number 2, God was selective in choosing those who would serve as priests. This is really going back a couple of weeks. Yes, chapters 21 and 22, there are some even physical characteristics that He had. And we suggested that just like animals were to be without blemish, God has a certain standard for priests. And they serve to represent the people. And so it made a difference. And then number 3, if Israel practiced the impurity of the people in the land, they would be removed from it. Yeah, chapter 18 of Leviticus. And what tells us that that's the case? What did God say about them? I mean, in the context of them, if they don't keep the law, they're going to be taken out, just like who? Yeah, the people that are in there, the Amorites. Remember Genesis 15, God says to Abraham, it'll be a while before you go in and receive this land because the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full or complete. And so it became full and complete. And so God took them out of the land and He put His people in the land, but He said, if you're going to stay in the land, you're going to have to do what will make you clean and holy. And of course, eventually what happened? They didn't listen, they didn't obey. Okay, so here's God's desire to dwell with man, and that was obvious back in Eden, and then man sinned, and God has been trying to reconcile Himself back with man. And so in a sort of, I say imperfect, not because God is imperfect, but in a sort of secondary sense, He's allowed that to take place in terms of this tabernacle by which he can dwell among them, and yet what? Even though he's there and he's right in their presence, what becomes obvious in the book of Leviticus? Yeah, there's a barrier. Not everyone can go in there, and that's especially so as we'll look at it tonight, the Day of Atonement. Yeah, Rick? Yes, yes. Okay, good point. Yeah, nothing casual. Yeah, it looks like we're going to camp overnight out here. And of course, they did it for a long time, didn't they? But the point is, this was not just go out there and have fun. This was God giving a people who had now become a nation, a law by which to govern them, anticipating an entrance into a land in which they're going to be on their own. And so what do? How do you govern yourself? How do you regulate yourself? Well, God's law takes care of that. But it depends upon their obedience to that law in order for that to happen. Is that still true today? You can have all the laws in the land, but if people aren't willing to obey it or do it, you're going to have problems. And so it's the same kind of thing taking place here. Well, I told my high school class, or the class on Sunday, you know, the book of Leviticus, you just open it up and like, where do I start? Or where does it finish? And yet, with kind of some basic information, you've got an outline. If you can remember 3 words, what are they? Can you look at the chart up there and see? I'll give you a hint. Yeah, rituals is one. Priests is the second one. And the third one starts with a P. Purity. Okay. Rituals, priests, and purity. If you can remember those 3 and then add the Day of Atonement, you've got it made. Because, as we've suggested, I can't prove that this is the outline of the book, but it certainly makes some sense that you've got some things that start up here, finish here, kind of balance each other out. And so as we've looked at this outline, we've got the rituals, both in the way of sacrifices and feast days. Then we had the priest being ordained and the qualifications given later. And then last time we looked at the ritual purity, clean and unclean animals, what happens when someone dies, what happens when you have leprosy or there is mold in a home, how do you deal with that? And then chapters 18 to 20, we talked about moral purity and some of the very things the people in the land apparently had been guilty of, and so God now says, you can't live like that. Okay, so real quickly, here are the sacrifices, and we'll talk a little bit about those tonight. So having some idea of these 3 different areas of sacrifices, burnt offering, fellowship offering, sin and guilt offering. And then the feast days we talked about, and we'll look at that tonight with the Day of Atonement down there. Okay, and then as far as the priests, we said the priest being ordained, which kind of ends sadly with what event in chapter 10 of Leviticus? Yeah, Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu are struck dead when they disobey God, right off the bat. And God sends a strong message that we're not going to tolerate doing this the way you want to do it. Strange fire, unauthorized fire, profane fire. All right, and then as we said, chapters 21 and 22, some of the regulations about who serves as a priest and what the requirements are and what some of the regulations are. Okay, and the last time we said we've got the ritual purity on the left-hand side and then God's admonition in terms of their purity, sexually and otherwise, that you not do as they did, whether it be Egypt or Canaan. Which brings us to that section right in the middle, the Day of Atonement. So we're going to spend a few minutes looking at that this evening. Notice that this occupies a central position in the book. That was kind of the point of that outline. Is that intentional on God's part? I don't know. It doesn't say, chapter 16, now is the most important part. But things seem to point toward that. And interestingly, where is Leviticus situated in these 5 books? In the middle. And where does that put chapter 16 in the middle of Leviticus? In the middle of the whole thing. Now again, I couldn't prove to you that means, okay, this is the culminating point, but it's certainly important. And so it's worth noticing. It really is a consummation of what we've studied up to this point in chapters 1 to 15, the sacrifices, the priests who are going to offer them, the need for purity, and someone suggested it provides the spiritual energy and motivation to carry out the rest of the commands in the book. So, it's called the Day of Atonement, but not in chapter 16. It doesn't actually call it that. Over in chapter 23, when we looked at the feast days, that's where, on a couple of occasions, it's actually called Day of Atonements. There is more than one sacrifice taking place. Maybe that's the reason why. Today, it's known as Yom Kippur. Yom means day. I'm assuming Kippur is some derivation of atonement. I didn't really look that up, but you've probably heard of that. And then it's even referred to as the day, which says something about its importance, just as the day. And then it's tied to, previously, chapter 15, verse 31, which says that there is not to be defilement as far as the tabernacle. I'm going to take just a second here to make sure my tablet stays on. Okay. So, chapter 15:31, thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. Okay, so this kind of leads up to what happens here in chapter 16. So let's look at the events that take place starting at verse 1 and 2. There is a warning here. What are we told in verse 1? This is after what? After the death of the 2 sons of Aaron. So even though there's been a break between chapter 10 and chapter 16, it's almost as if this narrative picks back up. And those 2 sons have died. And so the Lord says to Moses in verse 2, tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place. Now some have suggested as a result of that, well, maybe that's part of what Nadab and Abihu failed to do. It could be in addition to this strange fire, but strange fire is what's mentioned back in chapter 10, so maybe this is him just saying, you're not to come at any time. And of course, what we read in chapter 16 is going to bear that out. So, you're not to come at any time inside the veil before the mercy seat, so that what? He may not die. You don't think of the priest going in on the Day of Atonement to make atonement for the sins of himself and the people as the possibility he may not survive this. And yet, you know, what does verse 1 say? Here are 2 sons that died, and there's that possibility. And then maybe to bear that out, I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. All right? So let's look at the order here, and then we'll kind of look at a little sketch of what this might have looked like. So you've got a bull that's a sin offering, and a ram that is a burnt offering, mentioned in verse 3. Then the high priest was to wash and put on garments, maybe not all of those garments we looked at in that photo that we mentioned a couple of weeks ago. It seems to be a little simpler than that. And then there are 2 male goats that will serve as sin offerings, and a ram as a burnt offering. So we'll kind of walk through this. So the sin offerings are offered, the bull, and this is said in verse 6 to make atonement for himself and for his house, speaking of Aaron. So a bull is to be offered as a sin offering, and this is for the priest himself, because what? He's got sin. All right. And we'll see that in the book of Hebrews, that's obvious. That's one of the contrasts between these priests and Christ, who had no sin. All right. Then there are 2 goats, and they are to cast lots over these 2 goats. One is for a sin offering, and one is to be released. All right, so we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. But kind of interesting, one is spared in a sense, and one is not. And the one that is released into the wilderness, my version in verse 10 says, and I looked this up, and of course now I can't remember it, Azazel, I think is how it was pronounced. Azazel. What does your version have? Something different? Might start with an S. Scapegoat. Okay, we know that term, don't we? So that's a possibility, and it seems like there was a third term that's sometimes used. I can't think of it just at the moment. Okay, so you've got 2 goats. One is going to be the sin offering. The other one is going to be released, and we'll look at that in a moment. So then in verses 11 to 28, we kind of drill down into some of the details here. So Aaron, after having washed and put on these garments, and the bull having been offered as a sin offering, is going to make atonement for himself and his house. How does he do that? Where does he go to make atonement? Yeah, he goes, look at verse 12. He shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small, and he shall bring it inside the veil. Where is he? He's in the most holy place, the veil separating the holy place from the most holy place. As I say, we'll have a picture of this in a moment. And so he takes that censer in with the incense he puts upon the fire, and it says the cloud of the incense covers the mercy seat that is over the testimony, so that he does not die. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat on the east side. Sprinkle it 7 times. Okay? So that's his sin and his house. And then verse 15, he shall kill the goat of the sin offering. So this is the one, they cast lots, this is the one that's a sin offering. It is for whom? The people. Bring its blood inside the veil and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull. So he sprinkles that on the mercy seat. Thus he shall make atonement, verse 16. Note, for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the people. So it's almost as if we're atoning for the tabernacle because the people have been around it. And so you're making atonement, yes, for their sins, but you're kind of cleansing the place itself because of their sin. And so it says, so shall they do for the tent of meeting. All right, verse 17, no one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and for his house and for all the assembly. So it's only the high priest, and he's going in himself, and he's going into the most holy place and offering this sacrifice. But we're not finished, are we? So it says, verse 18, he'll go to the altar that's before the Lord. Now, which altar would that be? There are a couple of altars. There's that altar of incense that's inside the temple, inside the holy place. But there's another altar. Where is it? Out front, the altar burnt offering. I think that's the one this is describing. So he goes and makes atonement for it with some of the blood of the bull and the blood of the goat. So he's sprinkling blood on these different items in order to atone. And it says he cleanses it, consecrates it from the uncleanness of the people of Israel. And then when he makes an end, verse 20, Aaron shall lay both his hands, verse 21, on the head of the live goat, confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins. And then what do you do with this live goat? You take him into the wilderness and release it. Okay, interesting, isn't it? So I guess that's a little bit like the turkey that, gets spared on Thanksgiving Day at the White House or whatever that thing is. All right, he's released. And says the goat, verse 22, shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area. All right, let me finish this up and get to the diagram here. Sins confessed over the live goat. And then the priest changes his garments and he offers the burnt offerings of the rams. What do you do with the burnt offering? Do you remember? That's the one that you burn completely, indicating commitment, we said. Okay, so these are burned completely. All right? So there are all the actions that take place on the Day of Atonement. So let's look at that as good as we can here. All right, so there's the courtyard of the tabernacle. There's the altar burnt offering out there in the front, and behind it the laver in which the priest would wash, bathe, before he puts these garments on. And then if we move in here, I don't know if this is supposed to be a reenactment of the Day of Atonement, could be. But there is the tabernacle itself, so the holy place in the front and the most holy place in the back. And so you see those items there, the altar of incense that's before the veil, and then the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat, with the cherubim that's over it behind the veil. And that's where the high priest goes to sprinkle the blood. All right? So let's walk through again those sacrifices we talked about. We've got a sin offering that Aaron offers for himself and his house. And he takes that blood into the most holy place, sprinkles it on the mercy seat. There is a burnt offering of a ram, completely burned. And then you've got these two goats on which lots are cast. So there is a sin offering for the people. That blood is taken, and then he goes inside the most holy place and sprinkles that blood upon the mercy seat. And also a ram for the people, a burnt offering. So possibly here, the idea of the sin offering is, here is the means of atonement. Blood is being shed like all the other sacrifices. But what about the goat that's released? Well, we said he's going to bear the iniquities, but he's kind of released out into the wilderness. What would that indicate? Well, possibly the idea of the guilt being removed, God not holding that against others. And here's a passage that maybe fits with that idea. Psalm 103, 11 and 12. It's a great psalm. We don't have time to go through it now, but toward the end, it says this for verse 11 of Psalm 103, as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. So maybe that's this thought here. The goats going out into the wilderness and God's removing the guilt, even though blood has to be shed in order for that to happen. All right. So there he's taken away. All right, comments that you have about any of this. Here is the depiction of the burning of the incense on the censer before the mercy seat. Yes, yes. Okay, very good. In fact, perfect segue to Hebrews chapter 9. I want you to turn to Hebrews chapter 9. We're going to read through the entire chapter. And you studied this recently, and I didn't get to sit in on that. But we're going to go through it again. And now, having gone through that detail of the Day of Atonement, let's read through this and see if it makes sense to us. All right, so chapter 9 of Hebrews, verse 1, and of course this is right in the middle of a lot of things that the writer says about a lot of things related to the old law. Now even, verse 1, the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. I got to hear a speaker last week on Tuesday night who spoke about Hebrews 9. I thought, man, this is perfect. I get to hear this whole thing. And it's interesting, he started out by saying, here God is giving us a tour of the tabernacle. And that's exactly what it is. And so he described these different items. He said the lampstand and the table showing God's provision. And then look at verse 3. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place. Now this is interesting because he says, having the golden altar of incense. We've talked about that as being before the veil. It's described here as being within the most holy place. But what do we associate with that golden altar of incense? Do you remember? I think we talked about it previously. Revelation 8, I think, does this, that incense represents the what of the saints? Prayers of the saints. So God provides for us, God hears us. In addition to which he says, the Ark of the Covenant, covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna, again, God's provision, miraculous provision in the wilderness, and Aaron's staff that budded. Now, I think, wasn't that the occasion of Korah and those who rebelled and said, why are you, I think that's right, I might be wrong about that, but the speaker the other night mentioned that God was making choices, and that's what Aaron's staff that budded. He had chosen who was going to lead. And the tablets of the covenant, God's instruction to them. God has spoken. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. So, we could say more about it, but we're not going to, the writer says. Look at verse 6. These preparations having thus been made, let me catch up here, okay. The priests go regularly into the first section. Now, I don't know if it was the speaker the other night or someone else. Two things about that verse, and we've talked about them to a degree. What's striking about verse 6? Who goes? The priests go. Okay, so again, it's not everyone that has access into the holy place. It is only the priests that are able to go. And how often do they go? Regularly. What does that say? Continual. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's good in the sense that they're making, these sacrifices, but it's bad in the sense that you need to keep doing this over and over again. So the priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties. Now there's that word ritual. Interesting, isn't it? But into the second only the high priest goes. That's what we just read about. And he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. Now, here's the commentary on that, verse 8. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is what? The way into the holy places is, mine has not yet opened. What's he mean by that? Okay. Yeah, it's not yet open. In other words, his access to God is not yet for everyone, is it? There's a limitation. As long as the first section is still standing, which he says is symbolic for the present age, according to this arrangement, that is, this system of worship, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper. Okay, so that's a major point. Despite all they're doing, they can't perfect the conscience of the worshiper. But verse 10 deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. Okay, so hang on to that thought. Cannot perfect the conscience. Well, everything changes in verse 11. What's he say? Yeah. But when Christ appeared as high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood. So it's interesting. Jesus is this great high priest that, just as on the Day of Atonement, is now going into the most holy place. But whose blood is he offering? His own. He's the high priest. He's the sacrifice. It is his blood that's being offered. And how often does he do that? Well, we'll read about that in a moment. Thus securing an eternal redemption. And then look at verse 13 and 14. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh. So that seems to be an indication, like the previous thought about it doesn't cleanse the conscience. This cleanses the flesh. This is kind of a ceremonial cleansing. But then he raises the question, verse 14, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, that's the kind of sacrifice he is, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Now that's kind of interesting that he says, okay, those animal sacrifices couldn't purify the conscience, but by his blood he's able to do that. Do you suppose, why do we know that that's the case? Is it because when I'm baptized into Christ and my sins have been forgiven, I can feel something inside me that says, your conscience is now purified, versus that worshiper who would have offered those animal sacrifices and thought, well, I guess it's not really taking care of my conscience. Okay. 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 All right. Good. And that's what we're promised in the teaching. And my point is this, among other things, I'm not sure that worshiper could distinguish what he felt as he did what he did, thinking I'm trying to please God, from us when we do what God says is going to be acceptable and will result in the remission of sins. I'm not sure that it was a feeling one way or the other. You see, it was just that God reveals that this isn't sufficient, but this results in your forgiveness. Your sins are now forgiven. Not just in some ceremonial way, but in truly having been cleansed because Jesus has died for you. Yes. Yes. Exactly. No. Absence of emotion, no. Right. Very good. You said it as well as can be said. It's not the absence of, but it's based on. So yeah, what did the Ethiopian do once he was baptized? He got up and he went on his way rejoicing. Why? Because he knew his sins were forgiven. So I'm saying there's a sense in which that Old Testament worshiper would have offered that sacrifice or seen the high priest go in and feel like some sense of relief, surely. But maybe as it even became clear with Christ coming to do what he did, that wasn't enough. It was going to take a perfect sacrifice by which sin could truly be forgiven. Anybody else want to comment on any of that? Okay, let's finish up here. I'm going to skip over, not because it's unimportant. In fact, I heard another lecture on this whole matter of, it's interesting in verses 15 through 18. There's the word covenant, and there's another word testament, or some have will. Two different English words, it's all the same Greek word. It's the word covenant. And okay, why the difference? Well, we're not going to worry about that at the moment. And I think there are good explanations. But there must be death, I think, is the point that he makes. So verse 19, for when every commandment of the law has been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool. Verse 20 saying, this is the blood of the covenant. That's a reference to actually Exodus 24. That was another occasion when God had given his covenant. So this is not the Day of Atonement here. But the point that he's making, having said in verse 22, we're not there yet, are we? Okay. So he's going to say in verse 22, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. So Exodus 24, when God gave his covenant, there was the shedding of blood. Verse 21, in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. So I'll make a quick point here. Shedding of blood. Do we mean bleeding? No. What's the blood stand for? The life that is sacrificed and given for a sacrifice so that sin can be forgiven. All right, verse 23, let's finish up. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices. In other words, that suffices for the earthly tabernacle, but it doesn't do for the heavenly things. Verse 24, for Christ has entered not into the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. So Christ was raised to the right hand of God, but Hebrews tells us he was also a high priest entering into God's presence with this blood that he had shed for the sins of all mankind. Verse 25, nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now watch this. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, what happened? The high priest went into the most holy place and offered the atonement, and then he did what? He came out. What's Christ going to do? He's gone into the presence of God to offer his shed blood. What are we waiting for? We're waiting for him to come out, to return. a beautiful picture, isn't it? All right, so here are the copies of the heavenly things. And so Christ has entered into God's presence with his shed blood, and he'll appear a second time. I mean, his blood having been shed. All right, I'm going to skip this part because we're out of time. But verse 10 and 11 of chapter 17 bear out this idea. The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement. So life is being sacrificed in order for forgiveness to take place. All right, so next time we'll look at the first part of Numbers. You can look at those early chapters there, and we'll progress through Numbers and then briefly the book of Deuteronomy.